today's episode, we're going to try to answer the question that was asked by a viewer: which plait count is better for a single tail? And I'm going to give you my cut on that. And in having that discussion, we're going to look at an 8 plait count whip compared to a 12 plait count whip, compared to a 16 plait, and then finally a 32 plait. Now, when we generally are talking about plaits, I consider any plait counted whip that's built that's 16 plait count or less to be a working class whip. You might find that whip on a farm or a ranch, or in a circus or a vaudeville show, maybe even on a movie set. When we move into higher plait count whips, higher than 16 plait, say 20, 24, 32, 64, sometimes even higher plait counts than that, we're looking at collector's grade whips. So we've got one collector's grade whip, 32 plait count whip, that we're going to look at today. Now, one of these is a signal whip. We've got a snake whip, 2 bull whips. All of those classes of whips are appropriate for throwing in the dungeon. And I'm my own cameraman today, so I'm going to come up real close so I can get behind the screen and view what you're seeing, so you can get a good look at what these plait counts look like. So we're going to try to get a real good close-up here. You can see the 8 plait count. The strands are actually quite wide. And if I had an inch measuring down from the heel knot, in that first inch, if I counted the strands around the circumference of that whip, that signal whip, there would be 8 strands. That's why it's called an 8 plait count whip. When we move over to the 12 plait, you can see the strands are narrower, but they're still pretty sturdy, pretty substantial. And if we can do this, I want to get these side by side so you can compare a 12 plait with a 16 plait. There's very little difference. The 16 plait's a little bit thinner than the 12 plait. And then when we come into the collector's grade whip, the 32 plait count whip, you can see those strands are very fine and very attenuated compared to the working class whips. So, we like analogies. So using another analogy, if we went back to Middle Age times and we were looking at armor that warriors might wear, early types of armor were plate armor, and you might have a plate that covered the shoulder, or another plate that covered the bicep, another plate for the forearm, and that would allow you some movement as a warrior, but it wouldn't be very attenuated, or it wouldn't be very articulated. You would have some limited range of motion. I'm going to compare plate armor kind of to the 8 plait count whip. Certainly, it's appropriate to throw in the dungeon. You can see with my target, I'm able to throw it on a nice horizontal plane and keep it on target. And as I move in, I'm actually able to get movement with my streamers consistently. So it's certainly appropriate, but it's going to kind of be like comparable to the plate armor in the Middle Age times. And actually, when you get to higher plait count whips that have 1 or 2, sometimes even 3 bellies, one of those bellies will be an 8 plait belly. So it would, if you're looking at the inside of a 12 or 16 plait count whip, that's a pretty good example of the way one of those bellies would look. And then there would be a bolster, and then say a 12 or 16 plait overlay over that. So let's set that one aside, and let's look at the 12 plait count snake. Okay, 12 plait, I'm going to compare that, going back to my armor analogy, to when armor advanced and you had scale armor. And the size of the scales, or the scales down the arm, allowed the warrior more range of motion, more fluidity of movement, and just more ease in the battlefield. Well, the same is going to be true of moving up to a 12 plait count, whether it's a snake or a bull whip. That whip, because it's going to have more attenuation, the strands are thinner than the 8 plait, is going to be more articulated and have more fluidity and movement as it rolls out. But you can see I'm easily able to keep both the forehand and the backhand on target. So there's nothing wrong with a 12 plait count whip to be thrown in the dungeon. In fact, this snake whip, I throw it almost every set that I throw in the dungeon for my snake. When we move to the bull whip, the one I showed you because it was whiskey and saddle tan, and I thought in the video you could see the stranding better. It's a 4.5 foot bull whip, and I don't want you to see a comparison of a 4.5 with a 4 foot. So I'm actually going to switch this whip and introduce a 4 foot 16 plait bull whip thrown against a 4 foot 32 plait bull whip. So you can see a direct comparison of the same length of bull whip. Now the 16 plait is going to have a little bit better articulation than a 12 plait, not significantly, but some. You can see the rollout's nice. I'm easily able to keep it on both of my targets. If you imagine those be the shoulders or the butt of someone you're playing with. So I can do a control puff with this. I can keep it on target. Absolutely nothing wrong with a 16 plait whip being thrown in the dungeon. Is the 32 plait count whip significantly better than a 16 plait count whip? For example, most 16 plait count whips, I'm paying $65 to $75 a plaited foot. So you can do the math. That times 4 would be about the cost of that whip. 32 plait count whip, collector's grade whip, you're going to pay substantially more. You might be paying anywhere between $125 and $175 a plaited foot for a collector's grade whip, depending upon the whip maker. So we're going to throw it. In theory, it has better articulation than a 16 plait count whip. It would be like having scale armor that's very finely scaled and very finely crafted by a master craftsman to give you maximum articulation. But the attenuation of this whip, because the strands are much, much thinner, it's going to be more fragile, could be more prone to break. I'm going to kind of compare the collector's grade whip to like a Ferrari. If you have an engine part go on the Ferrari, then that Ferrari might be sitting in the garage waiting for parts, or even waiting for a mechanic that's skilled enough to repair it, where the 16 plait working Ford, if it breaks, is going to be more easy to repair, but because it's got thicker stranding, thicker plaiting, is going to be more durable in the dungeon and not as prone to breakage. It can withstand the force of being cracked over and over and over and over. This whip was crafted in 20,000. I've thrown this whip for over 20 years. It probably will never have a major issue with it, 16 plait whip. So Dex's short and long on this is if you're a beginning whip thrower, start with a 12 or 16 plait whip. If you're an intermediate and advanced thrower and you've been throwing 16 plait and you found a whip maker that you like and you're able to keep your whip on target in the dungeon and do with it what you want to do, then why would you pay a third to double more per plaited foot just so you can say you have a collector's grade whip?